selfish giant, the friendly giant.
Hello children, welcome back to yet another video lesson in English. So far we have completed two lessons from our supplementary textbook, and in this video lesson we shall deal with the third lesson, which is a very interesting, beautiful story. The name of our third lesson is The Selfish Giant by Oscar Wilde. Surely this one will be a very interesting one for you. This story teaches the importance of sharing the good things in life. Suppose we are ready to share the good things in our life, it will bring happiness to not just the one it is being shared with, but also the one who is sharing. A kind heart is always a blessing and is amply blessed by the Almighty. It also teaches that one gets what he gives. In this story, The Selfish Giant, Oscar Wilde has introduced a biblical theme. This story deals with the theme of humility, salvation, compassion, kindness, love, pain, etc. Before getting into the lesson, let's see who is Oscar Wilde. His full name is Oscar Fingal O'Flaherty Wills Wilde, and he was an Irish poet and playwright. He has written in almost all genres in 1890s, and he was a much celebrated writer in London. And his best known short stories are The Canterville Ghost, The Selfish Giant, The Remarkable Rocket, The Happy Prince, etc. I think all of you know who is a giant. Suppose you are unaware of a giant, you can see a giant here. Let's get into the lesson. Every afternoon, as they were coming from school, the children used to go and play in the giant's garden. So the story begins like this. It was a usual custom, it was a usual thing that after school hours, after returning from school, the children used to play in a giant's garden. It was a large, lovely garden with soft green grass. Here and there over this grass stood beautiful flowers like stars, and there were 12 peach trees that in the springtime broke out into delicate blossoms of pink and pearl, and in the autumn bore rich fruit. The birds sat on the trees and sang so sweetly that the children used to stop their games in order to listen to them. How happy we are here, they cried to each other. Here in this para, it is being discussed about the beauty of the garden. The garden was very beautiful. It was completely covered with soft green grass, and the flowers there were compared with stars. The flowers were so beautiful and it was bright like the stars. And the flowers were so delicate, that means they are so soft. Not only that, there were 12 peach trees in that particular giant's garden. And during the autumn season, these peach trees will carry or they will bore flowers, and after that, these flowers will turn into fruits. And birds used to sit on the trees and they sang very sweetly, that means in very beautifully, and the children in the midst of their play they will listen to the song of these birds and they will comment that they are very happy in that garden. One day the giant came back. He had been to visit his friend the Cornish ogre and had stayed with him for 7 years. When he arrived, he saw the children playing in the garden. In this paragraph, it is telling that the giant who had gone for a visit to his friend, the ogre means a human eating giant of Cornwall, which is a place in UK, otherwise Britain. After spending long 7 years there, returned to his place. When the giant returned, he saw children playing in his garden, and suddenly he asked, "What are you doing here?" in a very harsh voice, and suddenly the children ran away. Next, he commented that my own garden is my own garden. Anyone can understand that, and I will allow nobody to play in it but myself. So he built a high wall all around it and put up a notice board trespassers will be prosecuted. Here, the giant proclaimed or he announced that my garden will be my own. He is very selfish. He is not ready to share that garden with anyone. And he put up a notice board there stating that trespassers will be prosecuted. That means those who are entering without permission will be punished. He was a very selfish giant. The poor children had now nowhere to play. They tried to play on the road, but the road was very dusty and full of hard stone, and they did not like it. They used to wander around in the high wall when their lessons were over and talk about the beautiful garden inside. How happy we were there, they said to each other. Now the children don't have anywhere to play. They started to roam around the garden walls, telling that they were so happy inside. But those days are gone. Then the spring came, and all over the country there were little blossoms and little birds. Only in the garden of the selfish giant was still winter. The birds did not care to sing in it, as there were no children, and the trees forgot to blossom. Now, what happened? It's the springtime. But only in this selfish giant's garden, the birds didn't come, the flowers didn't blossom. Once a beautiful flower put its head out from the grass, but when it saw the notice board, it was so sorry for the children and that it slipped back into the ground and went off to sleep. The only people who were pleased were the snow and frost. Once a small flower put its head outside, but on seeing that notice board, it felt very sorry towards the children and it went back. The only people who were pleased with, that means the only people who are happy, are the snow and the frost, because there is no spring. So, the winter time, the products of the winter time, snow and frost can still go on. Spring has forgotten this garden, they cried. So we will live here all the year round. The snow covered up the grass with great white cloak. CLOAK. Cloak means covering. All the plants there were covered again with the ice, again with the frost. And the frost painted all the trees silver. All the trees, plants everywhere covered with the snow and frost. Then they invited the north wind to stay with them, and he came. He was wrapped in furs, and he rode all day about the garden and blew the chimney pots down. Now, not only the frost and snow, the wind also, the north wind also came, and it, with full force, it rotated in that garden, and it started to destroy the chimney pots. This is a delightful spot, he said. We must ask hail to come. So afterwards, hail. That means that ice balls, falling of ice balls, hailstone also came. So now, first of all, snow, frost, hail, everyone reached the garden and they are so pleased. They are very happy there. Every day for 3 hours, he rattled on the roof. Here, rattle means to make a sound. On the ceiling, on the roof, this hailstorm or the ice ball started to fall. He broke most of the slates and he ran round and round the garden as fast as he could go. He was dressed in grey and his breath was like ice. That means the hailstone was very much cold and it started to fall on the rooftops and it destroyed everything. The next para. I cannot understand why the spring is so late in coming, said the selfish giant as he sat on the window and looked out at his cold white garden. I hope there will be a change in the weather. Now only the selfish giant noticed that in his garden the spring season didn't start. So he is thinking, what may be the reason the spring not started in my garden, and he hoped that there will be a change in the weather soon. Next, but the spring never came nor the summer. But there was no change in the season. The winter persisted. There was no change to summer. The autumn gave golden fruit to every garden, but to the giant's garden she gave none. He is too selfish. she said. So it was always winter there, and the north wind and the hail and the frost and the snow danced about through the trees. So the winter season continued, and the frost, snow, and the hailstorm still persisted in the giant's garden. On one morning, the giant was lying awake in the bed when he heard some lovely music. It sounded so sweet to his ears that he thought it must be the king's musicians passing by. It was really only a little linnet singing outside his window, but it was so long since he had heard a bird singing in his garden that it seemed to him to be the most beautiful music in the world. On a particular day morning, he heard a beautiful sound from outside, and first of all, he thought that it may be the king's musicians passing by. But later, he understood that it's the beautiful sound of a small linnet bird. Then the hail stopped dancing over his head, and the north wind ceased roaring, and a delicious perfume came to him through the open casement. I believe the spring come at last, said the giant, and he jumped out of the bed and looked out. At the moment when he heard the sound of the linnet bird, the atmosphere there changed. The snow, frost, and the hailstorm ceased, that means stopped, and suddenly he felt a perfume came to his nose through the open window. And suddenly he stepped outside to look whether the spring reached his garden. Let's move to the second part. He saw a most wonderful sight. Through a little hole in the wall, the children had crept in, and they were sitting in the branches of the trees. So, what was that sight? When he looked through the casement or through the window, he saw through a small hole in the garden wall, children had entered the garden, and now these children are sitting on the branches of the tree. In every tree that he could see, there was a little child. And the trees were so glad to have the children back again, and they had covered themselves with blossoms. When the children returned and they sat on the branches, the trees produced flowers and were waving their arms gently. Now the branches of the trees are moving very gently. Gently means very softly. The birds were flying about and twittering with delight, and flowers were looking up through the green grass and laughing. It was a lovely scene. Not only the trees covered with blossoms, the birds also came to the garden, and they can hear the sound of the birds. They were twittering, and it was a very delightful experience. And the scene there was so beautiful. Only in one corner it was still winter. When the giant looked in one corner, it is still winter. It is still covered with snow and mist. It was the farthest corner of the garden, and in it was standing a little boy. He was so small that he could not reach up to the branches of the tree, and he was wandering all round it, crying bitterly. The poor tree was still covered with frost and snow, and the north wind was blowing and roaring above it. Climb up, the little boy, said the tree, and it bent its branches down as low as it could, but the boy was too tiny. When the giant looked in that farthest corner, he saw a tiny boy, a very small boy standing. And that particular tree was still covered with snow and mist. The tree is trying maximum to allow the boy to get on the tree, but the boy was so small that he couldn't climb the tree. And the giant's heart melted as he looked out. How selfish I have been, he said. Now I know why the spring would not come here. I will put that poor little boy on the top of the tree, and then I will knock down the wall, and my garden shall be the children's playground for ever and ever. He was really very sorry for what he had done. Now the giant understood why the spring season didn't enter his garden. Now he is thinking that I will help the boy to get on that tree, and afterwards I will blow down the entire wall around this garden. And he was very sorry for the action he had done. So he crept downstairs and opened the front door quite slowly and went out into the garden. He went downstairs and has gone directly to the garden. But when the children saw him, they were so frightened and they all ran away, and the garden became winter again. But what happened? On seeing the giant there, the children were afraid and suddenly they vanished from there. They ran away from there. Only the little boy did not run. We already studied that a small boy who was not able to climb the tree. He was standing at the farthest corner of the garden. He was still there. He didn't run because his eyes were so full of tears and he did not see the giant coming. The boy was crying, and so his eyes were covered with tears, and he didn't see that the giant was coming. And the giant stole up behind him and took him gently in his hands and put him up into the tree. Here, stole up means to come very silently. In a very quiet manner, the giant reached there and took him in his hands in a very gentle way. And afterwards, what he did, he put him up into the tree. The giant helped the child to sit on the tree, and the tree broke at once into blossom. Suddenly, at that moment, the tree was again covered with flowers, and the birds came and sang on it. And the little boy stretched out his two arms. Suddenly, the boy stretched out, or he put forward his arms and flung them round the giant's neck and kissed him. And that little boy hold the giant and gave a kiss. And the other children, when they saw that the giant was not wicked any longer, came running back, and with them came the spring. On seeing this incident, that the child gave a kiss to the giant, the other children understood that no longer this giant is a wicked one. Wicked means an evil one. The giant is a very peaceful one. It is a very gentle one. They understood, and the children came back. So next, the giant is telling, "It is your garden now." "Little children," said the giant, and he took a great axe and knocked down the wall. And when the people were going to market at 12 o'clock, they found the giant playing with the children in the most beautiful garden they had ever seen. On that day, by 12 o'clock, when the people there were going to the market, they saw a very unusual, strange thing. What was that? The giant was playing along with the children in the most beautiful garden they had ever seen. All day long they played, and in the evening they came to the giant to bid him goodbye. By the evening, the children came back to the giant to say goodbye. They are going back to their home. But where is your little companion? The giant asked. "The boy I put into the tree." The giant loved him the best because he had kissed him. Now the giant is asking the children about the little boy who he put on the tree, because that boy is the one who kissed the giant. The children answered, "We don't know. He has gone away. You must tell him to be sure and come tomorrow," said the giant. But the children said that they didn't know where he lived and had never seen him before, and the giant felt very sad. Now the giant is telling to the children, "Tomorrow, surely you should tell that small boy, that little boy, to come." But the other children replied that they don't know where that child, that small boy, lived. They were seeing that boy the first time. Every afternoon, when school was over, the children came and played with the giant. But the little boy whom the giant loved was never seen again. After that, every day it continued that the children, while returning from the school, they started to play in the giant's garden. But that small boy, that little boy, had never came back to the giant's garden. The giant was very kind to all the children, yet he longed for his little friend and often spoke of him. "How I would like to see him," he used to say. The giant was very happy and the giant was very kind to all the children, yet he longed for, that means he wished to see that small boy. He always said that he liked to see that boy. Years went by and the giant grew old and feeble. Feeble means weak. Years later, what happened? This giant became old and he became weak. He could not play about anymore. So he sat on a huge armchair and watched the children and their games and admired his garden. Now the giant used to sit on his armchair and he saw the children playing and he admired his garden. That means he enjoyed the beauty of his garden. The giant stated that I have many beautiful flowers, but the children are the most beautiful flowers of all. We can quote this statement to a biblical reference. God used to tell like this: the most beautiful flowers are the children. The giant is also telling the same thing. I have many beautiful flowers in my garden, but the most beautiful flowers are the children. One winter morning, he looked out of his window as he was dressing. He did not hate the winter now, for he knew that it was merely the spring asleep and that the flowers were resting. So, on a particular winter morning, the giant looked through the window of his castle. That time, he saw the entire garden was affected with winter, but he was not sad because he know that it's the rule of the nature. And now the flowers are only just resting, and surely during the spring they will return. With such a mindset, he is standing there. Suddenly, he rubbed his eyes in wonder and looked and looked. It certainly was a marvelous sight. He saw a very amazing sight there. In the farthest corner of the garden was a tree quite covered with lovely white blossoms. That beautiful sight was that in the farthest corner of the garden, a tree was covered with white flowers. Its branches were golden, and silver fruit hung from them, and underneath it stood the little boy he had loved. That tree was covered with white flowers, and its branches were golden in color, and that tree had silver color fruits. And the other striking thing is that the particular boy, the small boy whom he loved, is standing under that tree. Downstairs ran the giant in great joy. In so much of happiness, the giant ran down into the garden. He hastened across the grass and came near to the child. And when he came quite close, his face grew red with anger, and he said, who had dared to wound thee? For on the palms of the child were the prints of two nails, and the prints of two nails were on the little feet. Who had dared to wound thee? Cried the giant. Tell me that I may take my big sword and slay them. But when the giant went close to the child, he was shocked because the child's palms were having the marking of the nail. And also on the little feet of the child was there a marking of the nail. And suddenly he is asking, who hath? Here hath means old usage or old English usage, that means has. Who has enough courage to wound you? The meaning you. Tell me, who dared or who was courage enough to wound you? The giant is asking. And he again tells that I will take my big sword and slay means kill the one who has done this to you. Tell me, who is the one who has done this to you? The child answered, nay. Nay also old usage means no. But these are the wounds of love. Who art you? Said the giant. And a strange awe fell on him, and he knelt before the child. Okay, here the child gave a reply. No, you should not take revenge. You should not do anything. Again, the child tells that these are the wounds of love. The wound you see on my palms and on my feet are the wounds of love. This thing we can connect with Jesus Christ. We all know when he was crucified, nail prints were there on his palms and also on his feet. So, on seeing the child's present situation, a strange awe fell on the giant. Here, awe means a respect. A respect with fear fell on the giant, and suddenly he knelt before the little child because the giant understood that the child is God. And the child smiled on the giant and said to him, "You let me play once in your garden. Today you shall come with me to my garden, which is paradise." What was the statement of the child? The child stated that you allowed me to play in your garden, and so today you will come along with me to my garden. There you will rest, which is paradise or heaven. That means actually in this story, the child is the God who has come to change the mind of the selfish giant and succeeded in that. And now the child has taken the giant to paradise. And when the children ran in that afternoon, they found the giant lying dead under the tree, all covered with white blossoms. And on that day afternoon, when the children returned from school to play in the garden, they found the giant lying dead under the tree, and his body was fully covered with white flowers. Our story ends in such a manner, and when we analyze the story, we can tell that owning things is human, but we have to share it, and that sharing quality is divine. So God has come to this earth to teach such a quality. The same thing is depicted through this story. The selfish giant also first owned that beautiful garden. It is only a human quality, and when he shared it with the children, it is a divine or spiritual quality. I hope all you enjoy the story. Thank you.